Hello, everyone. Thank you very much for joining us on screen in midweek evening. Your interest and enthusiasm is much appreciated. I am Misa. I'm the chair of Ethnographic Materials Group at the Institute of Conservation UK. Also, I would like to inform you that this presentation contains images of Maori musical instruments made of human skeletal remains. Okie dokie, let me introduce you to the speakers today. Andrew Hughes is currently the Deputy Head of Conservation at the Pitt Rivers Museum, part of the University of Oxford. Andrew has over 13 years experience working in museum conservation, with 10 years working exclusively with ethnographic collections. As part of a small, busy team, his role encompasses everything from pest management and bench work to carrying loaned material and emergency planning. With an interest in material testings and identification, Andrew has collaborated on project testing the effects of historic conservation treatments on carbon-14 dating and the effectiveness of current pre-treatment cleaning techniques on carbon-14 results. Over recent years, Andrew has had increasing involvement with the planning and execution of several large storage projects and is currently involved with the planning of off-site storage improvements and improving the display and the storage of objects publicly accessible in openable drawers within the museum. Reid Hudson recently completed the MSc in Conservation for Archaeology and Museums at University College London. Previously trained as a juror and with a background in African studies, Reid has a particular interest in ethnographic collections, though she has worked on materials ranging from wall paintings to archaeological iron. Much of her research has focused on the sensory and experiential nature of cultural heritage, and a part of her degree, she undertook a 6-month placement at the Pitt Rivers Museum, where she considered the conservation and presentation of sound within the collection. She's currently serving as a conservator for the Middle Kingdom Theban project in Luxor, Egypt, where her work is focused on archaeological organic material and carved and painted limestone reliefs from a series of monumental tombs. That's you introduced. So Andrew and Reid, over to you.
All right, thanks, Misa. So let's get started. As Misa said, I am Andrew Hughes. I'm Deputy Head of Conservation at the Pitt Rivers Museum. And yeah, we're going to talk today about our experiences testing and playing around with 3D printing, with specific regards to 3D printing musical instruments, to see if that's a useful thing which can be used in museum collections. So Pitt Rivers Museum, if you don't know, is the Oxford University's Museum of Archaeology and Anthropology. It's founded in 1884 and currently holds approximately 350,000 objects. About 30,000 of those are on display. About 20,000 of those are probably in that picture right there. But about 9,000 of them are categorized as musical instruments. And out of those, about 400 are primarily made of bone or ivory. Now, as a museum, we really try as much as possible to give access to the collections, especially to originating communities. And during the providing access, often musical instruments are objects which come up. And the question of whether or not those objects can be played, like always, is something which is raised. And we don't like to restrict access to the collections, but we do have to warn people of the risks that playing those instruments, the risks that there are in playing those instruments. So our musical instrument collection has been stored in less than ideal conditions for a long time, decades. Generally, the environment's quite dry. I mean, it's not a playable, maintained instrument collection that's maintained for playing. And so, especially for any of the instruments, but especially for mouth-blown instruments, wind instruments, there is a risk of introducing like moisture, heat to those instruments may cause damage, irreversible damage. But probably more importantly than that is that we're ever increasingly aware of the extent of historic pesticide use in the collection. So we've had various projects in the past which have explored this. So here is some image of some micro CT scans of some Maori flutes. So the one on the left is a wooden flute, the one on the right is the Maori human bone flute. And those areas which have been highlighted show like really dense areas, really high density. And these probably show areas where there are traces of heavy metals, probably from historic pesticide use. So those dense areas are the same way that lead would appear white in an X-ray image. That's what that's showing there. And other testing which is done across the collection has found just all the usual pesticide, inorganic pesticides. So we have lead, arsenic, mercury, like strangely high levels of lead sometimes, but also organic pesticides such as DDT, lindane, dialdrin. These are things that won't show up on a CT scan. And they're things you definitely don't want to be putting in your mouth. They are, have serious health warnings attached to them. And so I think these are some of the things we have to warn people about when they ask whether or not they can play the instruments. And I think we don't really know the extent of the dangers that these pose, and that's an issue in itself. But with these risks in mind, I think quite often people decide against playing those instruments. But we've always thinking, what is the alternative? If we're not able to remove those pesticides, what's the alternative? So I think we had this CT scan data of these instruments, and that kind of got us thinking, is it possible to convert 3D data from this into printable, playable replicas? Like, what's involved? Is it possible? So in 2019, myself and the conservation team here, Jeremy Uden, Jennifer Mitchell, had the opportunity to apply for funding from the university's IT Innovations Fund, who just had a fund to try out technologies. Didn't mind if you failed, but it was just a way of testing out new technologies. And so that was the Plastic Fantastic project. And along with the bait collection, Department of Engineering, Cranfield University, and a lot of other people who helped out on this project, we had the opportunity to test out 3D printing, basically. So can't you just print a 3D replica? That's the kind of question which does come up with people do ask that. And if you don't know about 3D printing, if you've not really thought about that long and hard, it sounds easy, but there are a lot of different variables involved. From how do you scan the thing, what materials you're going to use, what printer you're going to use, what you can do with the data. So all of the Plastic Fantastic project was really set out to test all of this, but also test the effectiveness can we find an instrument which is playable and print a replica and then test the replica against a playable one? Do they sound the same? Essentially, that's what we're after. I was going to put a spoiler alert in here and warn you that yes, but there's a lot of buts. So printing musical instruments is not new. It's been around for quite a long time. This is just a screenshot of the Thingiverse website, which has publicly accessible 3D printing files. And this is just a search for musical instruments. You can see there's quite a lot on there. You can download STL files, which are the files used in 3D printing, and send it to your printer, and Bob's your uncle, you have a nice ocarina, or you can print out as many of those as you like. One of the instruments on there is a recorder, a Baroque alto recorder. However, I think the one thing with all these is that generally these files have sort of been created in CAD models, computer-aided design models. They're taking measurements from an original maybe, but they're all sort of like perfect geometries. They're sort of like perfect cylinders. All of the measurements are, you know, perfectly round, perfectly flat. And then there are so many different materials which are available to 3D print with, and different methods of 3D printing as well. And so, you know, can you just print a replica? Is like, yes, you can print a lot of different replicas, a lot of different ways. Do they sound like the original? It's hard to know, because we couldn't really find that it was ever really been tested that way. So our goal was to find something we could use that is playable to test against. So I've said there are about 400 bone and ivory instruments in the Pitt Rivers collection, but it's not a playable collection. Luckily, we kind of had access to the University of Oxford's music faculty's instrument collection, the Bate collection. It's a historic musical instrument collection, which is there for students studying music to use. And one of the instruments there was this recorder made by Goddard of London in 1672. And so, yeah, the idea was to scan this, print it out in as many ways as not possible, but as many ways affordable that we could afford in the funding requirement. And then compare that original to those replicas and see if they sounded different, what problems came up along the way, really. So yeah, here is that recorder. Handily, it breaks down into 3 parts, which was lucky because we needed it to. But it's very much not a perfect engineered object like those CAD drawings. It has splits, it has cracks. This is a view down the middle of the central portion of the recorder. You can see the tool marks. It's got cracks on the inside. It's no longer spherical. This is an image of the one of the most important areas of the recorder, which actually makes the sound. That is in like terrible condition. You know, it's cracked, it's warped, it's been modified, it's been repaired. Very much not a perfect instrument. But we weren't trying to make a perfect instrument. And in a lot of ways, this was very similar to objects found in museum collections, you know, which have all been played, they've been repaired, they have signs of use, signs of wear. And also, you know, this instrument's made of ivory. So it's not a material that's, you know, given sanctions on the ivory trade now, it's not actually available to craftspeople to make one from new using ivory. So that was another interesting element. So to start off, we needed to scan the object, and as we're familiar with the CT scanning, we were able to work with Dr. Fiona Brock at Cranfield University's Forensic Institute, who we've worked with on a few projects before. And using their micro CT scanner, so this is a higher resolution scanner than what's found in like a hospital setting. And this gives us internal and external structure in a 3D model. But there are limitations to the size and shape of the object that will fit into the scanner. The objects have to be mounted upright. It's got to be stable enough to rotate in the machine. So I think that was where maybe we were a bit lucky choosing a recorder which you could break down into 3 parts. It's not like you could fit a whole elephant's tusk in this machine. It's just not going to be feasible. So you can just about make out that end bell section of the recorder inside the machine there. And again, it sort of differs from medical CT in the case that where in medical CT, the X-ray source moves around the patient. In this scanner, the X-ray source stays stationary, and it's the object itself which rotates. So that also poses a little bit of problems, that you have to make sure that whatever you put in there is able to rotate, is stable enough to rotate. And the scanner takes hundreds of X-rays as the object rotates, and then computer program compiles those together into a 3D model. So this is like the first stage of your process. Now, I mentioned before the size of the chamber itself. This is the mouthpiece of the recorder. So the size of the chamber is a limiting factor as well, but also the size of the scan is a limiting factor. So although the mouthpiece fits into the scanner fine, the maximum sort of height of scan area is about 12 centimeters. So the mouthpiece actually had to be scanned in two sections, and then that file sort of digitally stitched together afterwards, which requires a bit of skill, which we don't have, but luckily colleagues at Cranfield did. And there's an element of sort of like cleaning, data cleaning, which has to happen as well. So stray little particles of dust might be picked up in the scanner. Other sort of issues where you've got to make sure that if you're stitching the two scans together, you're lining things up perfectly with correct reference points, etc. So it's not quite as straightforward as just putting in the scanner and out it pops the other end. But the main problem that we encountered, which we hadn't really foreseen, was the fact that it wasn't just an ivory recorder. It's an ivory recorder with a wooden block in the mouthpiece. So the wooden section which fits into the mouthpiece, and you see my person like through here, known as the block, and that's really important in the making the actual sound of the recorder. So the CT scan produced an excellent scans of the ivory, but like here is a picture of the scan. You can barely make out the wood grain of the block, which is sort of in this section here, and that's just due to the density of the different densities of those materials. So here is the block removed from the recorder. If only we'd have done this when we scanned it. It's made from a really light wood, probably cedar, and as well as that, as you can see there, it's been attacked by woodworm at some point as well. And so due to the power of the X-ray needed to penetrate the ivory, just so much information about the wooden block was missing. It was just too high power to capture the information about the block. And so kind of what the resulting data was really kind of just a huge amount of data, because it was picking up not just like the outer surface, and the outer surface is, and it's the solid objects. It was picking up all of the internal holes, the pores inside. It was a huge amount of data, and it wouldn't actually fit onto like a standard desktop PC. And yeah, this was something which we hadn't really foreseen, and yeah, it took quite a bit of sorting out really. So yeah, this is like an early attempt at like printing that block from that data. It's not great. And so I think more than the fact that we knew there was a lot of information missing about the surface of this part of the recorder, it's like managing the sheer vast volume of data that was in that was kind of an issue which I hadn't really thought about. So I said we worked really closely with colleagues in the engineering and science department of the university. And they tried to reverse engineer the block from the scans. So just using sort of CAD software, Rhino modeling, 3D modeling software, they kind of took the dimensions, the outer dimensions, and sort of produced what you see in the middle there as this 3D model of what the block might look like. But again, that's kind of not what we were trying to do. We did print off these, tried these in recorders, and actually they didn't work. You couldn't get a note out of them. And also, yeah, it wasn't what we were trying to do. We're not like replicating the original there. And so, yeah, we tried to solve this in quite a few ways, really. So by hand carving blocks ourselves, by taking those prints and like filling in the holes with filler and sanding them and shaping them. And there's sort of like variable degrees of success, but again, it wasn't that's kind of losing the point of what we're trying to do really. But luckily, engineering science worked with a company before called Polygonica, who are a company based in Sheffield, in the UK, and they kind of used the data which was available and sort of shrink wrapped the area which was that block to just produce the outer surface and remove all that inner data. There's like the tons and tons and tons of data points for all the little bits of wood inside there. And so they removed that and produced a printable file which maintained the surface information which we were interested in. I think ideally, again, what we would do is rescan the block at a lower power on its own, and that would be totally fine. And that's something we haven't considered, but definitely would consider that scanning something made of more than one density of material is certainly adds an element of difficulty. And yeah, and so this is the block on the left is the original, in the middle is that shrink wrap Polygonica digital file, and then on the right is finally the printed block from that Polygonica file. And it doesn't look great. I think if there are any instrument makers watching, they're probably wincing. It looks horrific. It just looks terrible. However, it just fitted into the printouts absolutely perfectly. And although it looked awful, it produced sound like perfectly. So worked brilliantly. So I've not really mentioned the actual printing yet, but we managed to print out five versions using different methods and different materials of the original. So not really going to go into a huge amount of detail about what these materials are, mainly because they're kind of quite closely guarded secrets. They are commercial materials. You might be told that it's an acrylic resin, that it's an ABS or something like that. But what additives there are, what differences, is kind of quite a closely guarded secret. We do have information about what they are. They're all available on our website, on our project website, which there's a link to at the end of this presentation as well, which you can find on the Pitt Rivers website. But yeah, we used 3 different printing methods, from sort of the most simple sort of budget-ish desktop 3D printer, which it's probably a hobbyist might have, to SLA printer, which uses ultraviolet lasers to cure a liquid resin, and a multi-jet printer, which they have in the engineering department, which is really high resolution, but able to print like more than one material at the same time. But another thing which we hadn't really thought of as well, which we probably should have done, but one of these objects, the recorders, the third one, this one here, which has a slightly weird looking end, was printed using the SLA method, using ultraviolet laser, which cures like a liquid resin. And we sent that off to be printed by an external company, and they wrote back to say, it looks like you're printing a recorder. And we're like, yeah. It's like, you're not going to play it, are you? Because the resin is known to, well, the uncured resin actually causes skin irritation. And that's a thing which we hadn't really considered a huge amount, that these materials are quite often used for prototyping things, which will then be produced using different materials. So maybe injection molded, and they're not necessarily like used for production and for human interaction, really. So this is a table of the various replicas, what they're made from. And I said before, this information is available on our project website. But we carried out testing, and this is kind of like, we got to this position where we had 5 versions and an original, and basically we carried out 2 evaluations. So we had one public evaluation where Chris Evans, musician, played the original recorder, followed by one of the replicas, and then the original followed by the second replica, original third, etc. And a public audience were invited to vote on whether or not they thought it sounded like the original or not. And then we had a second evaluation where 2 professional recorder players, Fatima Lahan and Olin Folks, were invited to play the recorders and comment from a performer's point of view. And I suppose it's kind of, kind of not the most scientific method, but it was actually quite clear results in the end. This is sort of like a histogram, I guess, of the voting from the public about which was the most similar to the original, which was the least similar to the original. And there was like a clear winner, which was one of the recorders, which was printed using this tan colored material, which was used mainly for printing dental models. And some people actually thought that one sounded better than the original, which was quite an interesting outcome. But it really clearly showed that there was a lot of difference in between the materials, and what material you choose does matter. Then from the evaluation with the professional musicians, actually from a performer's point of view, they thought it was a very different experience playing the original the playing, even the public's preferred choice of replica, was a very different experience. And I think that's something which is really interesting, and especially from a point of view from a museum offering to try and provide an alternative for a source community to play and experience what it would be like to play the original. I don't think that is what you're going to get. But we did make a video of the whole process, which again is available on the Pitt Rivers Vimeo site, and I realised that this is a talk about sound, and all you've heard is me so far. So I'll play a little clip from the video so you can hear the what those recorders sounded like. Let's try this.
A professional recorder player, Fatima Lahan, carried out another assessment of the replicas from a player's point of view. We invited colleagues from the university's music faculty and engineering science department to discuss the replicas and hear a wide range of opinions on the instruments.
And what we're studying is, so now let's think of in a very scientific point of view, we have a block of material A, block of material B, block of material C. How do they perform individually?
Yeah, to me that's no comparison.
That's why I was interested to know whether you meant that is the mouth making a difference, or is it the whole thing making a difference?
That would be a really interesting way to extend it, because this, I think, would play very differently with a different blocking.
I think it is already a very good result that these two can play together. Keeping a musical instrument on the under a glass window in a museum, if there's no use for the public. By making reproduction, we hope to let people learn and the sound of the old instruments.
Okay, so I'm going to hand over to Reed now, who's going to talk about some work which she carried out during her internship here, which sort of like built on what we found out from this project. So hand over to Reed again.
Let me see if I can just share my screen with all of you. Can everyone see that? And all right. So following on from what Andrew has said, I started my student work placement at the Pitt Rivers Museum in February 2021 as part of my degree in conservation at University College London. And I was very luckily handed the results of this plastic fantastic trial in order to shape my own research for my dissertation. And I chose to focus on the question of how you could potentially conserve sound itself at the museum, and how this could be used to facilitate access to sound as heritage, especially, as Andrew mentioned, for members of originating communities or musicians or students who visit the collections and want to play these instruments. So there's already been a lot of interesting work around increasing access to sound as heritage at the Pitt Rivers, and this informed my understanding of the topic. This includes the placement of QR codes over display cases, like the one that you can see on the left, where visitors can scan this QR code to listen to a clip of Zimbabwean musician Miles Mkuba playing an mbira like the ones on display. There's also been the craft replication of instruments like the ones in the upper right image. This was done by the archaeologist Richard Sermon. It's two pipes that are carved from modern bone based on instruments within the collection, archaeological instruments within the collection. And then the Sound Gallery's exhibition way back in 2012, which presented field recordings of Bayaka music from the Central African Republic and Northern Congo, which are held in the large sound archive in the museum. The exhibit intentionally addressed the social aspects of the music and incorporated ideas from Bayaka performances where you would listen to the music in the dark, or you would listen while singing along and moving in order to sort of embody this experience of sound. And in order to communicate this in the exhibit, and make sure that people were immersed in this environmental sound, they created a soundscape of Bayaka music and invited visitors to move through the museum at night with only torches to light their way. So that's the streaks of light that you can see in that image. It's people moving around through this sound-filled space at the museum. So the Pitt Rivers is actually really rich in sound and musical resources, and has already initiated a lot of interesting projects and exhibitions aimed at increasing public access to them, not just Plastic Fantastic. So moving forward in this context, the idea was to replicate an instrument from the Pitt River's own collection, as the recorder from the Plastic Fantastic trial was from the nearby Bate collection. And we wanted to look at an instrument which might otherwise be considered unplayable. And this could be for any of the reasons that Andrew mentioned: its age, its material fragility because it wasn't, maintained in a playing condition, or even the presence of pesticide residues. Additionally, I wanted to try and assess whether this technique for replication, the CT scanning and 3D printing of instruments, is a viable pathway for the preservation of sound and creating access to sound as heritage. And I wanted to consider all of this within the context of the Pitt Rivers collection, where, because of the sensitive nature of many of the objects, projects around digitization and replication need to be really carefully considered, often in collaboration with source communities and relevant stakeholders. So the material findings from Plastic Fantastic supported all of this theoretical work by demonstrating the qualitative accuracy of the replicated sound, because whatever original instrument that I chose from the collection would not be able to be safely played for comparison with the replica. So the acoustic properties of the resin that was selected as the winner in the Plastic Fantastic study were actually analyzed by James Kirsch, who is an engineering science student at Oxford. And he showed that the replica successfully matched the pitch of the original recorder, and its fundamental frequency was accurate to within 2%. So we could go forward with the selected resin with confidence that it would replicate the sound of an ivory or bone instrument with relative accuracy. So the experience of Plastic Fantastic also helped establish the selection criteria when it came to choosing an instrument. This criteria was based on material, of course. So the instrument should be in bone or ivory, since this was the material that was studied in reference to the printing resins in the Plastic Fantastic project. The size would ideally be under 12 centimeters, because as you saw, that was what can happily fit into the micro CT scanner. And the last consideration was that the candidates for replication needed to be functional. So they shouldn't be broken or unfinished. And additionally, the replica itself needed to be viable as an instrument. So choosing a bone flute or a whistle, which is a fairly streamlined instrument, should ensure that when it's scanned and printed, the replica would be simple enough that it would function as an instrument without further alterations. If there were moving pieces or composite materials in the original, like with the wooden block in the recorder, this would make the process a lot more complicated. So some of the instruments which I considered for this case study include the Maori bone flute pictured in the upper image that had been previously scanned looking for pesticide residues, a medieval English bone pipe excavated by Pitt Rivers himself in Kent. It's seen in the middle image, and this is actually one of the inspirations for the craft replicas that the archaeologist Richard Sermon completed at the museum, and a Haida eagle bone flute in the lower image, which has some really lovely incised decorations, which I hope you can see. Each of the instruments presented different complications. However, for example, the bone pipe excavated by Pitt Rivers was disqualified when it became clear upon further research that it was an unfinished example of a pipe, meaning that the replica would not meet the functionality requirement. And you can see that it's broken on one end, and actually there's a sort of vertical line cutting across one of the finger holes, which is actually a guideline for where the hole was being carved or drilled before the instrument was abandoned. So in the end, the instrument selected for replication was this Paleolithic whistle made from the phalanx or knuckle bone of a reindeer pierced with a single hole, donated to the collection by the first curator at the museum, Henry Balfour, in 1909. The whistle comes from the Magdalenian period of the Upper Paleolithic in France, which coincides with the end of the Ice Age and dates to 10 to 15,000 BC. So it's around 12 to 17,000 years old. perhaps too old to safely play. It was excavated in the Dordogne region along the Vézère River in France, which is indicated on the map to the right. And it was found in the rock shelter La Basse, which you can see in the middle image. So this instrument is categorized as a whistle, although it's actually a vessel instrument, similar to an ocarina or even an empty bottle, where you can blow across the opening to produce a sound. Using a Paleolithic instrument for my case study had a couple of really interesting benefits, one of which is that I was able to refer to the work already being done in sound and music archaeology, which gave me a basis for some of the theory that I was looking at around how conservation could view sound as heritage, and some of the different methods being used to replicate historic sounds. This study also has the potential to feed into further research on this whistle and the 3 others in the Pitt Rivers Paleolithic collections, which are a really unique resource that have not yet been widely studied. So following in the footsteps of Plastic Fantastic, once the instrument was selected, it was packed in a custom traveling mount and taken to Cranfield Forensic Institute, where it was once again scanned kindly by Dr. Fiona Brock. As Andrew mentioned, in the case of the recorder, the whistle had to be stable enough to set upright on the staging area of the CT scanner. And luckily, as you can see, it stood nicely on its own on a protective layer of plastizote. So we had planned and devised a couple different methods for supporting it if necessary, but it was actually very stable on its own, luckily. Following scanning in the resulting images, you can see 3 of the many X-ray cross sections that were produced, as well as one of the resulting 3D models. And you can see traces of a dense heavy metal outlined in red around the hole, which are likely due to the presence of residues from historic pesticides. Also visible are voids in the structure of the whistle, which are due to the porous nature of the knuckle bone itself. Similar to the issue of the porous structure of the woodblock in the recorder, we were unsure if this would cause issues in generating a model and printing a replica, but we decided to process the data as simply as possible and try to print it as is to see what the results were. So once again, the replicas were printed by Dr. Peter Walters at the Engineering Science Department at Oxford in the Visijet tan material, the tan resin that was selected during the Plastic Fantastic trial. And as Andrew mentioned, it's commonly used for dental models due to the fact that it has added mineral filler components, which give it a bone-like feel and appearance, which is potentially why it behaves similarly to bone and ivory. You know, it has a very similar density. So on the left, you have the original whistle, and on the right, you have the very first replica that we printed. In order to try and understand how that internal porous structure may have been affected by processing the data and printing the replica, several other replicas were then printed in a more transparent resin material as both a whole whistle and in cross-section. These replicas showed that the porous structure of the original bone whistle had been retained, as you can see in the areas outlined in red. So no huge changes to the structure of the instrument occurred during this process, and the porosity of the bone itself didn't cause any huge issues in the printing process itself. And I'm very happy to report that all of the replicas do indeed function as a whistle. So it was shown that the proposed methodology was successful in producing a functional replica of the whistle, thereby creating access to a sound that is roughly 12 to 17,000 years old. Contextualizing this research in the wider collection highlights some limitations for this approach to the conservation of sound, however. While replication through such processes can provide access to sound as heritage, there are ethical considerations around the digitization of heritage that must be assessed. So going back to some of the instruments considered for replication, each of these instruments highlighted potential issues for future digitization projects. I already touched on the unfinished medieval pipe, but in the case of the Maori flute, the bone was actually human bone, which of course entails serious ethical considerations before it can be used for any research. And we were lucky enough to speak to some specialists at the Te Papa Museum in New Zealand who advised us that because we didn't have a lot of information on the provenance of this particular instrument, it would take a lot of work and a lot of time to identify the community it belonged to, who we would need to work with in order to truly assess the ramifications of replicating this flute. And it just would have been a much bigger research project than I had time for, sadly. In the case of the Haida flute, we had a chance to speak with a member of the Haida Nation who works at the Haida Gwaii Museum in British Columbia in Canada. And he advised us that on a previous visit by delegates from the Haida Nation to the Pitt Rivers Museum, they had actually seen this flute and they had recognized it as something which very likely belonged to a secret society, which would therefore make it inappropriate for replication, especially without, once again, extensive collaboration and discussion with the community. So in future, any project of this kind will likely need to consider why the replicas are being made, what the replicas will be used for, and whether scanning and printing is really the best approach, even though we've seen that it can be a very effective tool for replicating sound. One of the possibilities being considered by the Pitt Rivers is the idea of replicating objects to facilitate their restitution, as was the case with a Tlingit killer whale hat repatriated by the Smithsonian Institution in 2005. So 7 years after repatriation, the Smithsonian, with the permission and help of the Tlingit, created a model of the hat, which is on sort of the upper left of this image, with laser scanning and photogrammetry, and manufactured a replica out of wood supplied by the Tlingit, which is now on display in the Smithsonian Natural History Museum. And the original hat seen in the lower right has returned to the community once more. Another possibility raised by this research concerns other forms of replication, as there is also the question of whether funding the craft replication of instruments by members of source communities may not be a more valuable way to do this in some cases than replication through digital means. Andrew mentioned, of course, that ivory, for example, isn't a material that we can access in order to make an exact copy of an instrument like the recorder or many of the instruments in the Pitt Rivers collection. But for instruments that are made of bone or even wood or other materials, there are more possibilities for artisans to come and study these objects at the museum in order to craft replicas. And something like this has already taken place at the Pitt Rivers, where two carvers from the Haida Nation, Gwaii and Jalan Evinshaw, created a replica of the Great Haida Box that you can see here during a month-long residency in September 2014. And following the residency, they took the replica box they had created, seen on the right, back to their community, where they have used it as a teaching tool in workshops around the continuation of Haida carving designs and techniques. And this is important because just as the Pitt Rivers aims to incorporate digital technologies into displays, it has also committed to nurturing partnerships with originating communities and contemporary artists. And this could possibly be through an expanded residence program. So for now, the replica of the Paleolithic whistle has been given to the Education and Outreach Department for inclusion in their Stone Age to Iron Age unit for primary school students. The sound of the replica might also be incorporated into the display of the original through the use of a QR code, like was seen with the Imbira display earlier. Going forward, it's clear that while we may have the means to access the sound of historic instruments at the Pitt Rivers, the process is not as simple as you would think it would be. And projects of this kind need to engage in communication and collaboration with communities to do this replication responsibly and respectfully. So it is our hope that this case study, alongside with the results from Plastic Fantastic, can facilitate future discussions around the possible benefits of this kind of replication. So for example, you've seen that CT scanning can not only help us locate traces of heavy metal pesticides that can inform decisions around whether or not it's safe to play an instrument, but if the decision were made to play a historic flute, for example, 3D printing a replica from the CT scan data could also furnish visitors with a very similar practice instrument, which would hopefully allow them to make the most of their limited time with the original. The experience of playing the replica versus the original differs greatly, but in terms of judging the sound and sort of getting a handle on what you're going to be performing, it could be really valuable. So there are many possibilities with this kind of technology, but of course, none of this work could have been done without the generous support of people like Dr. Fiona Brock, Dr. Peter Walters, the entire conservation team at the Pitt Rivers Museum, and all of the specialists and community representatives that were kind enough to have these initial discussions with us and give us their time and their expert opinions. So we really have to thank everyone involved. And Andrew, I don't know if you want to add in any thanks and acknowledgement.
Yeah, yes, just thanks to everyone really who helped. I think it was a really useful project to do. So I think we wouldn't be able to do it without funding from the IT department, which sounds strange, but it was funding which was actually there to allow us to test and fail, and test things out, and it's fine to test and fail, and I think that was what was really useful. So yeah, if you're after more information, then or have any questions, then please ask them now, or you can find information on the Pitt Rivers website and the projects section and the Plastic Fantastic project. And then also the video that was made, which has better sound recordings where you can hear the actual results of what we did, is available on the Pitt Rivers Vimeo site there. So yeah, thanks a lot. Thanks for listening, and let's know any questions.
Thank you very much, Andrew and Reid. And yes, if you have any questions, please start typing up in Q&A. While people type away, I just want to say congratulations on your resounding success. What a wonderful way of making the inaccessible accessible, the unplayable playable. I really feel emotional in the idea of, you know, sounding a whistle from Paleolithic time, you know. So so I can see a question already. Are you guys ready for questions? Let's start.
We can try our best.
Yes, we have about 6 minutes for the questions. So let's go. Wonderful project and talks. Was any harmonic analysis of the sounds made by the original recorder and the replica?
Yes, so a student from the engineering department, which Reid mentioned, carried out quite extensive acoustic analysis of all of the original ivory recorder and all of the replicas, and so that was carried out and published in his
I think a master's dissertation similar to mine. So yes, we came at this topic from two very different approaches and directions. But yeah, he did extensive analysis of all of the resins that were used in the Plastic Fantastic trial, including the one that was selected as the winner, which is what then allowed me to just continue on.
Right, so next question. Are your 3D scan available download somewhere? I'd love to 3D print them.
I think that is linked to some of the issues that we found that need to be considered in more depth in terms of, you know, if we're working with communities to make these scans and the 3D files, who owns the data then? You know, are we as the museum going to be the caretakers of this data, or are they going to be owned by the communities? And I think in most cases, it's just going to have to be decided on a case-by-case basis. I think it is unlikely that we could just scan something and then make the scans, you know, publicly available. It would have to go through a process of a lot of collaboration and communication before we could get to that point. So for now, I don't think the recorder scans are necessarily available.
Recorder scan, the recorder is not our recorder, so that makes a bit of an issue. But also, like, there are other things which people, that just the practicalities of these things as well, is that, like, the files are massive, and hosting that data is, like, has quite a big impact as well. So yeah, I think there are other issues than besides just like the ethical ones as well. So yeah, it requires a bit of thinking about. So they're not available at the moment, no. So.
Thank you. Right, the next question. I learned so much from this talk and from your dedication to this work. Did you find the material close to the original bone? That's presumably the resin that's used quite often for the dental model, did you say?
Yeah, I think from when we started looking at this, we kind of looking from a lot of different perspectives. From should we try and make a replica which looks like the original, that feels like the original, or are those secondary to actually just sounding like the original? And we, you know, it's definitely visually different from the bone, but not massively so. But we weren't attempting to try and make it look exactly like the original. This was about trying to replicate the sound, really. So, you know, it is close acoustically to bone. So if that's what you mean by close to the original, I don't really know what close to the original means, really, but
and actually, if you're referring to resin, then yes, Andrew is spot on. But in looking at sort of the work being done in sound and music archaeology, for example, there is like a huge tradition of making replica instruments out of sort of craft replica materials. So I was lucky enough to speak to Richard Sermon, who had done the craft replication of the pipes in the museum, and he recommended that I just try and find a reindeer knuckle bone and carve my own whistle. And again, I actually sort of found somewhere that I could maybe procure one, but not within the timeline for this project. But the work being done in sound and music archaeology, they've really explored a lot of the options, from, you know, using the exact same material to just make a new instrument, to creating sort of a virtual model, not even a 3D model that you would print, but a virtual recreation of what they think the sound would be like. So yeah, there's a whole range of how to approach this.
Thank you. Right, next question. This is a question for Andrew. Did I hear this right? That communities may come and play an instrument. I've just done a health and safety module, and this surprised me. What if they get ill?
I think the thing is that people will ask if they can. And we are, I suppose, traditionally, maybe the conservation approach is like to say no, because you might damage the instrument, but we don't want to prevent, you know, access for us from a source community to objects from their own community. So I think it's more to do with informing of the risks. And so in the past, I believe that, you know, we'll inform it similarly to whether or not people can handle objects without gloves. You know, that it's probably the same risks, but a lower, the same hazards, but a lower risk maybe. And so people will take the. It's about informing of risks, and so that people can make their own judgment about those risks. Maybe.
Yeah, I mean, as conservators, I don't think that we can make medical decisions. So we can furnish, you know, visitors with as much information as we have about the presence or possible presence of pesticides, and, you know, discuss the potential hazards and health sort of risks that are inherent with that. But as Andrew says, it's also, you know, not necessarily our place to always say, no, you can't have access to this.
I think practically, when people are told of the risks, it's, you know, make the decision that, okay, I'm not going to take that risk. I suppose it's always there as an option. And I think, you know, there may have been occasions when people have said, okay, I'm fully aware of those risks, but I'm willing to take them so I can, like, engage closer with the object. So.
Thank you. Well, we have 4 more questions, and then time is now, basically. But are you happy for like 5 more minutes and then answer them quickly, if you can?
Yeah.
Yeah, let's do it. Right, next. Did the audience preferences agree with the scientific analysis of the sounds?
Yeah, they did, yeah. So
Lucky.
Good. Right, next. Oh, that's a good question. Do you have any idea on what you would like to try and 3D scan next?
No. I think that I think that people have, it's not new, 3D printing is not new technology. It's been around for decades, but it's often, ever since I've been in conservation, people have been like, yeah, oh, we can use 3D printing in conservation. But I've never really seen it used that effectively. And I think it sort of grabs all the headlines. I think there'd be much more use of using different types of like replicating technologies such as CNC, stuff like that, which you could use actual, not have to have the element of you're using a strange replacement material. You can use like with like, and yeah, I think what was really interesting is that this is kind of like a really useful, practical use for the engineering department. Absolutely love working with these because they're so used to the theory but don't really necessarily see a practical end use to a lot of what they're doing. And so they're really interested, especially in the acoustics of like, and so yeah, I don't know. That's the answer.
Can I just say from my perspective, when I was looking and trying to find an instrument to replicate, there are so many at the Pitt Rivers that I think would be really, really wonderful and promising to do this with. But almost all of them would entail a really long time commitment to have the appropriate conversations and to figure out their provenance and do the research that you need to do to actually come to terms with what it means to digitize and replicate them. So I think there are many instruments in the collection that this could be useful for, but only in cooperation with the relevant stakeholders. So there's a lot. Yeah.
Fascinating answers. Thank you very much. So next question is for Reid. Actually fascinating. Thank you so much for sharing your research. Would this method be able to be used in your current project, Reid, if replicating ancient Egyptian sound?
Ancient Egyptian sounds seems like an entirely new topic that I'd love to look into. I actually mentioned a case study in my dissertation where 2 trumpets were famously discovered in the tomb of King Tutankhamun. And the BBC had I think an army musician play them for a live radio broadcast in 1943 or something. And during practice, when they inserted a modern mouthpiece into one of the trumpets in order to make it playable, it just shattered the metal, which is a really good cautionary tale of why it's maybe better to replicate these things than to play the original sometimes. So I think King Tutankhamun's trumpets are okay now, but I don't think it's a good idea to necessarily play them again. So yeah, there's probably quite a few case studies in sort of in the archaeological field, much as the Egyptian archaeological field, where this could be a really good solution.
Well, I have to say, I'm going to use that example next time. Just next time I need to scare someone from the playing his music instrument. Then thank you.
Apparently the conservator who was on hand, Alfred Lucas, just almost fainted. He had to be taken to the hospital for hysteria because
poor thing.
You've broken it.
Okay, so the last question. How long are those resin models likely to last before they begin to degrade?
Your guess is as good as mine. I think that's kind of not the problem with 3D printing, I guess, is you have a digital file. And so what you well, no, that's not true. I think there is the issue of how long they're going to degrade because your digital file may not be accessible forever. I think that is one other thing which is a big issue to think about is how are you going to store this data? Are you going to have the same programs to be able to access it? Is the same printer going to be able to use it in like 10 years time when 3D printers they've, you know, changed and advanced, and this file is now some measly tiny rubbish thing that doesn't mean anything anymore. But yeah, it's a good question, because yeah, what's in these resins is unknown. There is a bit of a secret. They're not necessarily being designed for long-term use, and you know, people who work in museums know the problems that plastics cause in collections and how difficult they are to look after. So yeah, it's a tricky thing, but I guess we'll find out as more and more sort of like 3D printed materials end up in museum collections and more studies go into what they're actually made of.
Wonderful. That's a lovely rounded answer. Thank you very much. And I think that's all we got time for. Thank you very much, speakers, for the wonderful talk. And thank you very much, everyone, for joining us. Look after each other. If you haven't had a dinner, bon appetito. And I'll see you soon. Thank you very much. Bye.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone.